Good afternoon. We're delighted to have you all join us at the Collaboratory seminar series this afternoon. And I am delighted also to talk to you sort of about the ground rules for today's session. Next slide. For some reason, I'm not seeing the slides. There we go. Just to remind you, this session is being recorded. The recording link will be shared with all of you and the registrants after we're done. And we'll also have it. We also have the session live closed caption. Please post your questions as we go along in the Zoom question and answer pod at the bottom of your screen. That's how we will know what you want to talk about as we move through the presentation. At the end of the session, we'll actually allow you to unmute yourselves and ask the questions directly. We have quite an exciting set of programs coming up in the 2022 seminar series. In March, we're going to have a presentation about PCORnet and the PATH subnetwork. That will move us forward into thinking further about our theme this year regarding data. And then in April, we're going to talk about how we get from code to clinic and how we raise the bar on evidence standards. Then we have 2 workshops scheduled, one in May to talk about sort of what is, after all, a learning health system. And we'd be delighted to have all of you join us for that session. And then in June, we're going to be talking about how you actually operationalize a learning community. So once again, we'll look forward to seeing you in those workshops. Today, we have an exciting set of presentations on the invisible infrastructures and how they support enabling all of us to see data in a federated fashion and support our research. Our first speaker is Jeff Brown. He's the Chief Scientific Officer at TriNetX. Dr. Brown is an internationally recognized expert in the use of real-world data to explore the evidentiary needs of regulatory agencies and medical product sponsors, and an expert in the assessment of data quality of real-world data sources. Prior to joining TriNetX, Dr. Brown worked in the Department of Population Medicine at the Harvard Medical School and the Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Institute. His primary research activities involved new approaches to facilitate large-scale multi-institutional research through the use of distributed health data networks to support a learning health system. This research formed the basis for several established research networks, including the FDA Sentinel system and PCORnet, which we'll hear more about in our next session. Dr. Brown is the inventor of ProMedNet, an open source software platform that facilitates a distributed healthcare network. Dr. Brown holds a master's degree in economics from Tufts and a PhD in social policy from Brandeis. Our second speaker, Marcy Harris, is a member of the Emerita faculty at the University of Michigan School of Nursing, Department of Systems, Populations, and Leadership, and now works as an independent consultant to several clinical research informatics initiatives. Dr. Harris obtained a PhD in nursing from the University of Nebraska Medical Center and completed an NLM postdoctoral program in biomedical informatics at the University of Minnesota and the Mayo Clinic. She is a fellow of the American College of Medical Informatics. Prior to the 10 years Dr. Harris spent at Michigan, she has held joint positions as a career scientist and administrator of nursing informatics at the Mayo Clinic. She has deep research and practical experience in electronic health record data, vocabulary and ontologies, and clinical data reuse for research. So I can now turn this session over to Jeff Brown.
All right, I think that worked. Thanks, Doug. I'll assume everyone can hear me. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes. First, I appreciate the chance to do this and speak about these topics. I've spent 20 or more years kind of doing, trying to generate evidence with real world data. That's how we say it now. That's not how we would have said it 20 years ago. We would have used different words to mean the same thing. But it's all about how do we collaborate is actually what my career has been about. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes just on level setting, on some terminology. We probably have a broad group of folks on the phone. Not everyone's a real world data expert. I'm going to talk about how I think of federated networks or distributed networks broadly with some examples. And then Marcy's got a great presentation about kind of more details, what it's like to be on the node side, which you'll get to understand on these networks. So just making sure I can move. So I am an employee now of TriNetX for about four months. I spent about 16 years at Harvard Medical School doing this work, and I'm mostly going to be talking about the work at the medical school. And I am the inventor of PopMedNet, which Marcy will describe. So it's an open source piece of software that we built to try to facilitate distributed networks. So real world data, just to set the stage. It feels like a new term. It's kind of a new term, but it's a new term referring to something that's been around for a very long time. Think of it as just data collected as part of routine healthcare. When patients go to the doctor, doctors document that care somewhere, electronic health records now, and then physicians or health systems in particular send bills to health insurers to pay for that care. That generates a record. All those records are real world data. It's just stuff that happens during the routine care. And you can add public health registries. Those are also routine. If you are vaccinated, for example, in any state, whoever stuck a needle in your arm is required to tell the public health registry in that state about that immunization. They're not required to tell your doctor, but they are required to tell the local immunization registry. There are 64 of them in the United States. So the same for birth registries and death registries, actually cancer registries. So those I would include as part of this kind of real world data collection. And you can go kind of on and on about things that are collected just in the routine of care or just routine life. Real world evidence is knowledge generated using that data. That's how I think about it. So there's data and the evidence. I just want to level set quickly. This is actually one of the first books I read probably in grad school. We've been doing this for a long time. This book is 60 years old, and it was describing quasi-experimental designs. Quasi-experimental designs are essentially what we use when we're not doing a randomized clinical trial. We're doing something with observation. I used to call it observational data, apparently. It's real world data now. So these designs have been around for a long time, and we've been doing this work for a long time. This is a paper that's 50 years old. And it was it used Medicare claims data I won't go into the kind of the study, but it was actually a pretty famous paper. This was in Science in 1973. So we have bigger computers, we have better software, we have faster computers, we can do more things, but it's not new and the methods aren't new. And so we should really be making sure we rely on the knowledge and experience of everyone who's come before us when we're doing this work. So a quick note about, sorry, I just want to move my controls a second so I can see what you guys are seeing. About a federated network. So it is, I'll actually tell the story of why these were created. I think I have time. So one of the kind of driving forces behind this idea of a federated network, which is leave the data with the people who are responsible for protecting it. So if you're a health insurance company, leave the data with the insurer. If you're a health system like the University of Michigan, leave the data behind the firewalls at the University of Michigan, and then try to use that data, have other people use the data, but don't have it leave your system. So that is the nature of these federated networks, and I'm going to talk a lot about those, right? But the idea is the partners keep their data behind their firewalls, and you send questions to the data, and the response is an answer. The answer can be a single number. The answer could be a whole set of age, sex, aggregated information. When I worked with the FDA, the answer was often something like, of the people, there were 1 million years of use of this drug, and maybe 1,000 years of use of this drug, and 100 heart attacks. That's the answer I needed. The analytics might have been very complicated, but those analytics we have behind the firewall. The answer is not PHI. So this is a way of using protected health information and information that's confidential actually to the health system, and serving and generating knowledge and generating evidence without allowing that person protected data to leak. I said I would tell you how some of this happened. Generally, it's easier if all the data are in the same place. It's easier for the analyst, right? If you're a data scientist, you'd rather have everything just sitting on your computer, but that's not typically possible. I'll mention this just because of the vaccine scenarios going on now. In the old days, this was 90s, a bunch of health plans used to send vaccination data to the CDC for analysis, for safety. Everyone thought it was a good idea to do, until someone submitted a Freedom of Information request to the CDC to get that data, because it was federally funded, and now the CDC had possession of it. Well, that caused a lot of trouble for the people, the institutions. Harvard Pilgrim, where I used to work, was one of those. That Freedom of Information request generated a lot of tension that went all the way up to the CEO, right? So after that point, the data actually were never given to the requester. But after that point, it was deemed, it was sent down to us, thou shalt never send data out of the system, right? So you can't do that anymore. So then they had to come up with another way of doing it. The Vaccine Safety Data Link really was the early adopter of that work and drove a lot of the work that happened behind it. So that was the story that I don't think has ever been told. It's never been published, put it that way. So I'm going to shift gears a bit to describing how I think of networks, and I think of how to create and build them, or how you think about the ones that have already been created and built, and then give a couple examples of how it plays out. So if I'm asked to build a network, I've built several, from scratch, and some came in to try to help run. But these are the questions that you have to always ask and be really clear about. What's the purpose of the network? What's the governance? And if this slide could all just be governance, 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 governance. It's always going to be about governance. And funding. So why are you doing this? Who's running it? Who's funding it? Who's overseeing it? Network management, oversight. Who's responsible for that? A common data model and data curation have to be addressed when you're dealing with distributed analyses. Again, it's all these distributed analyses when you think of it that way. How are you going to answer the question, your analytic approach and your querying technology? There are networks where the querying technology and the analytic approach is to send a Word document that says, please tell me how many people took this drug, and please tell me that by age and sex. That can be a query, that can be an approach. Others send analytic code. Others do point and click querying, and it goes out into the wild and comes back with an answer. All of these are viable approaches, but you have to know which one your network is going to use and why. So that's query distribution and response as well. Privacy, confidentiality, security pieces are really important. How is that going to be handled? Dissemination and transparency is also really important for the folks who are providing or sharing their data and the folks who are trying to generate knowledge from that data. So a couple examples, there's a couple slides I'll go through pretty fast. Vaccine safety data link, I always put at the top, and then you can see the rest. There's plenty, I've got slides, there's lots and lots of networks that are floating around. So I messed up my build here, that's on me, but I wanted to show a little bit about the technology pieces here. So if you have, when you initiate a query, a question in a network, and again, that question could be computer code, it could be anything. Someone has to send it to someone, right? So you can have a menu-driven query, SAS or SQL. It could really be a Word document. It could be a protocol and say, please implement this protocol at your site. It could really be anything. But it has to get to your partners. We, in many of the networks I've operated, because we built PopMedNet for this purpose, we used this infrastructure called PopMedNet. Before PopMedNet, we used email, and before email, we actually used things like FedEx when we were moving data around. So PopMedNet, this is create a query and send it out. Somehow it has to get out to your partner site. So if Michigan was part of a network, it somehow has to get to Michigan. And Marcia will talk a little bit about this in PopMedNet. But at Michigan, is it like, do you have a SQL database, SAS, Oracle, all sorts of questions about that and how you're going to organize that and what data model do you have? At some point, that question, that query has to get executed behind that firewall and generate output. Someone has to figure out how to do it. Sometimes that's a person, sometimes it's just a computer and it's automated, but at some point, that chunk of information has to get behind the firewall, execute, and then return. And that's all software. It can be software enabled. There's lots of ways of doing it, but most networks now are software enabled. That information has to get back to some central location that was asked the question, and then you have to do something with it. And you can imagine, I showed one round, but if you do this at 100 locations, then you have to figure out how do you aggregate that information and show it to the person who needs to see it, and actually not show it to people who don't need to see it. So that's just a little more on the technical side of the networking. Excuse me. So when you're thinking about, so I think I listed, I think there's actually 10 things. So when you're going on purpose and funding of the network, what are the goals? Architecture. So one-to-many or all-to-all is a really interesting question. And Marcia, I think we'll touch on. One-to-many, sent one person or one group asks everyone else, or everyone can ask everyone everything. Those are two network architectures. They lead to two really different solutions. Who is going to actually ask the questions? How many different people? Who gets to see the results? What are they allowed to do with the results is actually really important. So the same question could be used for medical safety, or it could be used for pharmaceutical marketing purposes. Well, those purposes are different. And you have to actually be careful about what the purpose of those intended use. Is everyone in this network expected to participate, or is it opt-in or opt-out? Important. How is it funded? Is it funded at all? Is it grant by grant contract? Is it there's networks of the willing? that exists now. And that's important to understand because it will dictate how networks run and operate. So management, these are how I think about it again. Is there a strong operations center? Is it something that's really an operations center dictating to the rest of the partners, or is it more collaborative? And it can be collaborative if it's central, but it'll feel different. How do you do knowledge management tracking? When you have networks, you have this great opportunity to learn, but if no one's actually writing it down or tracking it, you won't learn. You got to figure out if you're going to do that or not as part of these networks. Who approves query distribution? So there's all sorts of governance around who gets to do what. The common data model is this question. So you don't need a common data model to have a distributed network. There's lots of different ways of doing it. But if you're going to have one, if you're going to use a common data model, then you got to pick one, and then you got to decide whether you're curating or not. Is it verified in a network of the willing? How do I know that everyone actually implemented that model the same way? It's really easy to make data look like conform to a model. And that's really different than having it be trustworthy. I'll use trustworthy is, I don't know the best word, but I'll go with that one. That people really did apply or populate the model as you'd expect, even if it looks fine. So level of conformance. So this is all about this curation. Well, who decides on curation? If someone's paying you, then you probably some central location decides. But if there's no money changing hands, whose responsibility is it? This is just trying to the idea of a common data model. I'm going to skip that for a second. Just for the sake of time. So if there's a common data model or not, you still need to decide on an analytic approach. And this idea of throughput, once a year, once a month, once a week, once a day, really kind of matters a lot in how you build the model and all the expectations in the network. Do you have to respond? How fast do you have to respond? Kinds of things are you doing? You actually have to worry about analytic and computational intensity. In our work with FDA, we've had queries that run for more than a day, and you kind of need to know that. I'm going to go through the rest of these. How does that query get behind a firewall is a technical question, but it needs to be answered, and there's lots of different ways of doing it. So there's a whole set of this infrastructure. You have to deal with all these. The response to querying, automated, manual. Well, is there a human involved or not? And where is the human involved? Again, that's all architecture. Any of it's possible. It's not going to be about the technology and is it possible. It's just going to be about the governance and SOPs and privacy rules and security rules. I'm just skipping over some of these. There's an awful lot of regulation and law around using personal health data. So how are you going to deal with that? And beyond personal health data is partner confidentiality is actually incredibly important. So I always use surgical site infection rate as the example. You start studying surgical site infection rates across hospitals, networks shut down really quickly. And there's actually a couple other examples like that. So you do have to be really careful what you're doing and be thoughtful. Level of security required. Who ensures the security? Who enforces these policies? And again, what happens to results? It's not obvious that you have to decide, because some partners will be happy with use of results in one way, but not another. And you have to be clear and transparent about it. And even all the way to publication rights. Who gets to publish, who's going to be an author, who's going to get recognized, all of those things actually have to be described. I just have a couple examples of networks. I want to be clear. I included some of these already. There's a lot of networks floating around. The first two slides were US networks. These are some European, the C-Nodes is a Canadian network, it's Asian networks. They're all essentially follow the same idea of federated research. Federated research is always about sharing. So This is a topic that I've been trying to focus more and more on, is how do you encourage the folks with data to share it? And because without sharing it, we can't learn. You need enough people to share to be able to learn. So what motivates people to share and what stops people from sharing? And then what do you even mean by sharing data versus sharing results? And what's the give and take there? Excuse me. So I'm just going to take the last maybe 10 minutes to go through 3 examples of 3 different kinds of networks. So the electronic support for public health, it's ESP. There's actually in Massachusetts, it's called MDPHnet, Massachusetts Department of Public Health Net. And it's an electronic medical record network for public health. The purpose and funding, so think about it, I'm going through these in the MDPHnet version of the world. So what's the purpose? It is public health surveillance conducted by the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, full stop. That's why it's been built. The Massachusetts Department of Public Health will dictate who's doing what. They're writing the check, and they describe, and they determine what happens in the network. Network management, actually there's an academic group, it's where I used to work, kind of oversees the network, funded by the Department of Public Health. They picked a common data model. They actually have their own data model. Everyone likes to have their own data model. There's good reason for that. And they're responsible for data curation. They've developed some pretty sophisticated analytic approaches and how to query. They're using PopMedNet mostly. And that's also how they're doing query distribution is PopMedNet. Privacy, security, confidentiality. These are the MDPHnet is a network of health systems in Massachusetts partnering with public health to do public health surveillance. Much of that surveillance actually required, right? So all health systems are actually required to report infectious disease cases to the state, but most don't. This is one way that health departments can meet that need, or actually health systems, sorry, meet that need. But there's lots of other examples here. But the idea here is it is still going to be, this is one-to-many, all the queries coming, decided by the state, run through a coordinating center at Harvard, distributed by that Harvard coordinating center for the state to get results. And that's what they're doing. They're doing it for public health. There's some publication, but it's public health network. This is the basic approach. The data still sit behind the firewalls. They're organized into a common data model and results sent to the Department of Public Health. So I should have said, not only does Harvard, is the folks at Harvard that run the network able to query, but actually the Department of Public Health staff can do it as well. They can log in and issue queries. And then the results get aggregated, and depending on the kind of query and the kind of permissions and user authentication, the results will come back in one way or another, aggregated, and then the Department of Public Health gets what they need, they would hope. And this is just an example of the kinds of information that they get. So they can do looking at chronic diseases, obesity, smoking, things like that. They can look at it by zip code, see how it changes. They can do it by race or ethnicity in zip codes, and do all this kind of risk heat maps within Massachusetts for whatever disease they might choose. So this is a system built for the Department of Public Health, but it's a distributed network. Department of Public Health doesn't have access to any person level data. So that's a state public health department and how they organize their network. Again, one-to-many, strong central control. This is Sentinel is an FDA initiated program, which is 13 years old about right now, that FDA runs. So I helped kind of create and run this for a long time. It's mandated. So if you want to, it's a nice stable network because it's been written into law. So in 2017, it was thou shalt create the Sentinel initiative, and it led to the creation of the FDA Sentinel system, which still operates today out of the operations center out of Harvard Medical School, where I used to be. It's Again, these are all distributed networks. Sentinel has, I think, 18 data partners right now, mostly health insurers is how to think about it. Purpose, governance, and funding. It is medical product safety surveillance funded by the FDA. Full stop. No one else uses it. There's no other login to anyone. That is what Sentinel was built for. There's some subtlety to it, but Sentinel was built for the FDA to conduct public health safety surveillance. It was really clear it's safety. Network management and oversight, that was done in the coordinating center at my own employer, so that was at Harvard. There's a data model, it's different than the MDPH net data model. Data curation was handled by an operations center. The analytic approach and querying technology were chosen by us. The analytic approach, we end up using SAS mostly. And PopMedNet was querying technology. Query distribution was PopMedNet. Response was some mix of PopMedNet and humans. Privacy confidentiality, we have all a very kind of sophisticated governance mechanism for how we use the data. And dissemination and transparency, interestingly here, the governance said everything that happens in Sentinel will be public at some point. And at the point is when there's a kind of a set of rules about when FDA makes the information public, but it will all eventually be public. MDPHNet does not have that requirement. It goes to the Mass Department of Public Health. They have no responsibility to post it on our website or not. FDA committed, they didn't have to commit to doing this, but they committed to doing it. And that was part of our governance discussions in creation of the network. Sentinel, I didn't have a slide like this for Mass Department of Public Health. There's only a couple sites there. I think it's 4 now. It's possible it was 3. It might only be 4. They're all health systems in Massachusetts. Sentinel, there's 18 data partners and all sorts of scientific partners. I think when I left, when I was running the Sentinel at Harvard, I think we had 40 subcontracts to all of this group, but it was all part of this big federated network where we were answering questions that were important to the FDA, and only FDA gets to ask. There's a lot of detail on the Sentinel website. It's actually a slightly old screenshot, I think. Lots of publications, all the code is online, all the questions are online, all the results eventually get posted with all the code sets. But they get posted once FDA is done with the query or the question. And it's regulatory based. When FDA is tracking a safety signal, it's called a track safety issue. And there's a regulatory requirement to track it and then close it. And they do that, and when it's closed, they can then post results. FDA, these Sentinel data have been used for regulatory decisions for years. This is real-world data being used for regulatory decision-making. In this network of those 18 partners, there is no expectation that partner 1 can query partner 2 or query 7, or partner 7 can query partner 5. It is all one way. MDPHNet, again, was all one way. And that's based on governance and funding, and that was the agreement that was laid out. The last network I'll describe is where I work now. And I spent 16 years at Harvard working on federated networks like Vaccine Safety Data Link and the HCSRN, the Healthcare Systems Research Network, and CoreNet. Originally, CoreNet was a joint project between our department and Duke. Actually, Rob Califf, who's now the FDA commissioner, was the co-PI of CoreNet when it began. And Marcy will talk about CoreNet a bit. So I've been doing this for a long time, but now I have a new job that's sitting on a global federated network just because it needed to be more complicated for me, I suppose. So purpose, governance, and funding is totally different here. It is a network designed to facilitate clinical trial optimization. From the very beginning, the idea was that we were helping pharmaceutical companies find sites to do trials. So in that world, the site can't be anonymized. That's the whole point. The whole point is the site. We need, as when you build this network, we need to be able to say, I'm just using drug company names, but we need to be able to tell Merck that there were 500 people at University of Michigan that meet their trial inclusion exclusion criteria. That was the point of the network. So we had to negotiate rights to show those names. In Sentinel, we never publicly show any of the names of our partners associated with results. We show the names of our partners, but not with associated with results. Here, the whole point is to associate numbers with sites. So we built it differently. There's different governance. The funding model is different. It's a give and take with our healthcare partners. So I'll keep using Michigan as an example. Michigan's not actually part of the TriNetX network. Michigan gets clinical trials and gets access to research. Our partners, if we just use Michigan as an example, would get access to the to our research platform, and we bring them trials and we sell that to the pharmaceutical industry that is looking for trials. And there's a couple of there's actually several other use cases, but it's a very different structure. Again, it's not going to be network to network nodes querying each other, but it's a many to many, but it's a slightly different many to many. So our health systems don't query each other, but you might have all of our partners that are pharmaceutical manufacturers can query all of our other partners, and it's global, and it's run by us essentially. So it's a private company, and we run it, and that's our job. We now have this global network of EHR data through hospital systems. But again, the purpose is very different. It was privately funded, so there's an awful lot of money sitting behind it to fund all of the technology. So it's a very slick system that you can query. I can sit now on my laptop and query healthcare data across the globe in real time and get an answer in seconds. CoreNet was supposed to be able to do that, but didn't have the kind of funding needed to do it, and this didn't have the right people and organizational structures to do it. But here we are. It's really the same thing, different purpose, different goals. Big network. I won't go through all of this because I want to hand this over to Marcy in a second. The idea being that the 3 different networks, 3 different ways of organizing those networks, and 3 different goals for those networks. The last one is different than the others. There are very few networks that actually allow everyone to query everyone else, which is a really interesting problem. TriNetX can do that a little bit, but primarily it's industry to health system. But let me stop there because I want to make sure we have enough time for the rest. So I think I will stop sharing how that will work.
Hey, thank you very much, Jeff. We have some questions here, but I think it might be best to turn things over to Marcy, and then we can pick up the questions at the end of our session. So Marcy, are you ready to roll here?
I think so. Okay, Jeff, great setup for this. And one thing I want to call out is that Jeff's discussion has been at the level of the networks, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper, change our perspective just a little bit. Obviously, Michigan was part of the phase 2 funding for a clinical data research network that was hosted at Mayo. Members of that network have since moved and assigned themselves to other CDRNs. So I think some of the information here might be a little bit dated, but I think it's still very generalizable to the current state. The call out I really want to make is the early support and involvement of folks at the University of Michigan and partners in our other nodes that we're implementing who gave, and it was volunteerism at the work level of time and shared expertise to work, review the work we report here, but also to build the nodes themselves. Just to two definitions here. Infrastructure, we adopt the definition of infrastructure as assemblies of objects. So it's not just the grid that our operational systems sit on. It is the entirety of all the tools, the standards, the technologies, the people, and the relationships that are needed to carry out tasks and goals. And importantly, infrastructure is embedded in a social, technical, and organizational structures. And that's a very important construct to keep in mind. Infrastructuring then is the activities that contribute to the successful establishment and then the sustainability of information system use. And we're really talking about information and knowledge-based systems here. So the title comes from a couple of observations that researchers who study cyber infrastructure particularly have noted that both infrastructure and infrastructuring exist in the background. They're invisible and they're frequently taken for granted. This just exists. We turn on our light switch and we have light. Both the consequence of this, though, is that the workers and the work itself is easily undervalued, underfunded, and marginalized when it's invisible.
Marcy?
Yes?
Do you have slides that you're sharing?
I thought I was. Sorry about that. Let me look. I probably didn't do share my screen here. Sorry about that. Thanks.
There we go.
Okay.
Now presentation mode.
Are you seeing the full?
There you go.
All right, good.
There you go.
Thanks. So the theoretical foundations of this notion of infrastructure come out of these two fields of computer-supported cooperative work and then the sociology of science. And these fields have developed over 20 or more years. They have focused primarily on cyber infrastructure in the realms of energy, physics, astronomy, and even HIV collaborations as the information infrastructure that enabled that work to proceed at the rate it did. It also touches human-computer interaction broadly, and then the science of team silence to a lesser extent. And I wanted to mention that a lot of this work has been funded by considerable NSF funding. So even in healthcare, it's not necessarily coming from NIH or HRQ. A lot of it's coming from the NSF, and they still have some active calls out there about this. This notion of infrastructuring and infrastructures that broadly look at objects and relationships and the enacting and enabling of those. The foundational concerns in this whole field have been this coordination and collaboration across time and space, the design, use, and sustainability in information and knowledge-based systems, and then the activities, again, the actions, the verbs that contribute to successful use. The three dimensions of infrastructuring that we're really focused on today are enacting technology, organizing the work, and then institutionalizing that work. And we'll come back to those in a few minutes. If you want to kind of read up on this, a good place to start is some work by David Ribes and Tom Finholt. Both Finholt is at the School of Information at Michigan, and David Ribes was a postdoc there when he started to do this work. Well, why theory? I want to just do a little bit of a shout out to Patty Brennan, who's many of you know is head of the National Library of Medicine right now. But she had a 2008, I think it was, article where she said, if a theory exists, the first step is to select that theory that's going to guide the endeavor. It's a right and a responsibility. We're seeing that theme echo in big data analytics, theory drive data, does data drive theory development? Regardless, I think there is a need for theory because it answers some questions about how. And to date, most of what we're seeing is what when it comes to these federated research networks, not how do you actually build them. So turning more specifically then, just to clarify, we are talking about federated research networks independent of the federated data networks. Those two terms exist independently. You can have a federated research network without having a federated data networks, and federated data networks can be used for things other than research. You know, surveillance is one that Jeff mentioned, or quality observations and management. What we really care about in PCORI type studies are federated research and data networks, which include features of both the federated research networks and the federated data networks. And let me explain that a bit more. So PCORNet has evolved over time. In phase one, which started probably around 2014 or so, PCORNet named itself as a clinical data research network. Phase two kind of merged or morphed into a descriptive term of a clinical research network, you know, suggesting a little bit less emphasis on the data, more on the research. And in phase three, which is where PCORNet sits now, PCORNet is described as an integrated partnership of clinical research networks and a coordinating center, a network of networks. And the notion of data has kind of almost disappeared. The network concept still persists. The technology base has remained constant over time, and Jeff did a nice job of explaining that. It's the things I want to emphasize is that PopMedNet's platform to implement the distributed health networks. It has these three components: a query tool, data mart client, and web service API, which support the interaction of nodes with the larger network, and both the receipt of queries and the return of results. The data are distributed, as Jeff said, across multiple locations, and then each data partner retains control over its access. This language and the underlying terms come directly from the PopMedNet website, as do the PCORI terms that I mentioned. As an analogy, I just want to point up this notion of federation of a distributed network. The Japanese rail system is perhaps, you know, one of the best examples we see where we have a distributed network design. You can see nodes all over the place, and there are little nodes evidenced here. But so the Japanese transport systems is very distributed. There are over 100 and some private companies, regional companies, and they're privatized. They're not government owned, but they cooperate on this notion of interchangeable fares and integration. And the result of that federation is an efficient, punctual, easy to traverse network. And that's certainly the goal of the federated research and data networks. But it's dependent at the very lowest level on these nodes operationalizing some of the federation principles. Well, in PCORNet and many other networks, this concept of a node is missing. So PCORNet, as I said, it talks about clinical research networks. The networks have partner organizations. Some of the partner organizations have PCORNet data marts, not all of them. And in PopMedNet, they have talk about their data partners. The partners have data marts, and those marts have to conform to common data models, standards, operational processes. We couldn't start to look at answering the questions we wanted to answer without naming something as a node, and that term doesn't exist in this network literature or at the high levels of description of the networks themselves. So for this presentation and in our work, we're defining a node as the most distal point in a clinical research network where the data marts, the queries, the researchers, and the governance are aligned and interact to enable the research studies. The nodes must be a partner organization, they must be a data partner, they must host conformant data marts, and they must function within a partner organization. And I think what you see is that this last bullet of functioning with a partner organization is not called out in PCORNet or in PopMedNet, and that's where kind of the rubber hits the road when it comes to implementing a node. As an example, this is 2018, so this the GAO had to generate a report to Congress about what has PCORNet produced at the end of phase 2. And I think this is just a really telling diagram. This figure looks at the process by which researchers receive data queries. The researcher sends the query to PCORNet centrally. PCORNet distributes it to their network partners. The network partners at the time of this report, there were 21 people-powered networks, 13 clinical data research networks, and 2 health plans. Currently, there are 9 data research networks and 2 health plan networks. Those groups submit their results, and the researcher receives them, collates them, aggregates them. But where are the nodes in this? So talk about invisibility, or evidence of invisibility. I think when the federal government doesn't recognize that there are nodes that are actually implementing all of this, it's problematic for us. From our perspective, the node is central to enabling this research. The node is to enabling. It's not central to the network, but it's central to enabling the network. And the work of assembling the objects that are needed and is what we're talking about with infrastructuring. So the nodes receive queries those queries may be research studies, analytic queries to run. They may be asking for just cohort identifications, how many participants of type X do you have, and they may be doing the data characterization or data quality checks that on the MART itself. At the level of governance, however, on the right side, the governance actually, PopMedNet and PCORNet collaborate with the Duke Clinical Research Institute for the Coordinating Center and have a level of governance setting requirements and milestones and standards of operations for the node. These clinical data research networks, it was LHS Net at the time of this study. I think next month you'll hear about PATH as a research network, also exert quite a strong level of influence on the node in its operations and what's done. But the strongest governance level to which the nodes must respond is at the level of the institution. This node sits, for us, it was within the University of Michigan med school, and there are all sorts of policies, procedures, standards, those sorts of things that have to be aligned across these levels of governance. The technology was not nearly as complicated as aligning the governance principles. These challenges of federation are recognized. There's a wonderful study out here by Goldstein looking at 6 European countries that have collaborated in knowledge exchange. And I'm calling out just conclusion 7 here, saying that a major challenge is the complexity and fragmented nature of the research data environments in which they evolve. Those are the nodes within the organizational needs. Specific to healthcare, a little bit earlier, Mandel and Cohane wrote a really nice paper on Federalist Principles for Healthcare Data Network, and they called out the challenges when you're instrumenting healthcare systems. And they use the term instrumenting similarly to the way we're using the term infrastructuring. But it's this integration of the top-down approaches to the local system that we just mentioned, the harmonization of data to a common data model. And this third one is often overlooked, but it's the pace at which the local IT departments can scale up their efforts within constrained budgets and competing priorities. So this was written just as PCOR was getting started. They weren't referencing PCORNet, but it's applicable to PCORNet as well. Well, this is I've only found really 2 other studies that have looked at what's happening at the local site. They're very, very limited. We're putting this focus on the sub-networks and the top level, the research networks themselves. So the aim of our study then was to identify and then recommend some theoretically grounded, pragmatic questions that organizations and institutions might consider if they're thinking about engaging in a node or expanding the scale of their network work. How do you design and sustain a node? So this motivation is similar to a lot of the questions we heard last month from Chuck Mayo. What does it mean to be, a resource such as a node? What types of resources were needed? What organizational processes? can anything from the BCORNet effort be repurposed or shared if and as we join other networks? That has happened. And how similar or different was our work from the experience of others in the network? And I don't know if John Brucelow from the Research IT group is on today, but John Brucelow set the whole team down in a room one day and said, I need to know and I need to explain what has it taken to build this, and how did, do we want to do it again, and do we want to engage in that going forward? So, after this was up and running, we retrospectively probably did a case study to look at these research questions. How did we assemble the components of the infrastructure? What work was required? And then what theoretically grounded pragmatic questions we really wanted to draw on this cyber infrastructure research, which has strong parallels to the network-based research we're doing. There's a paper out on this. I think Lisa was going to put a link to that paper in the chat if you want to look at some of the details. So again, our procedures, participant observation, kind of standard qualitative research. We did an extensive review of all the artifacts collected over that 3-year period of time, conducted interviews, and we importantly engaged members of the teams in a mind mapping exercise for classifying the work efforts, and I'll show you that in a second. Our analysis was quite iterative. We did a lot of reviews of capability and maturity models, expecting they would help us classify these work efforts. The problem was that none reflected these dynamic, complex relationships. And it's technology to people, it's technology to the organization, organization to people. There are 2-way, 3-way relationships that have to be managed. One of our early architects of this whole system said, it was engaged in doing the capability and maturity of work, and said, where's the connective tissue in all of this? Where's the glue that makes it all hang together? So we turned this to this infrastructuring theory, and it really provided a much more useful perspective as we identified and characterized these themes from the data. Then we triangulated the data. I think what we're going to show you is what we think is a theory-based framework. We did establish internal generalization with colleagues at Michigan. People say, yeah, I wish we had known that and asked that before we started. And we got the same response with colleagues from other nodes in that same CDR when we asked, what did we forget? What did you have to do that can't be answered by one of the questions in the framework? So our first question, how were the components assembled? And just a reminder that the infrastructure definition is assemblies of objects. So it's people and it's technical resources and it's policies. We assembled teams. They were loosely aligned with BCORNet structure. These were new teams that didn't previously exist in the organization, or people who were coming together for the first time often to work on this. We had a core leadership team that really was out there driving the project to completion, and also turned it over to ongoing operations, which our node is now within a new unit in our CTSA, called a network-based research group. And Dave Williams is presenting on that, I think, next week or next month. We had a steering committee that provides the overall governance. This group had to do a lot of alignment with state regulations when it came to data use agreements, had to help not mitigate and mediate conflicting policies and requirements within the organization. It wasn't complicated. People wanted to do it, but it was just new territory. We had a joint technology and informatics team to really look at the technical system and the informatics resources that were needed. The research teams, were called together in a more ad hoc manner when a study came forward and we wanted a local PI participating in the BCORNet study, and then the patient stakeholder engagement team. And I think Michigan was particularly successful in having a very active stakeholder engagement team that participated at the national level as well as the sub-network level. So one of the major challenges, and again, it reflects this invisibility of the nodes, is that all the milestones that were published by PCORNet were at the level of the clinical data research network or the clinical research network, but the evaluation was of local implementations. The data reside at the local organizations, not at the research network level. We had to meet 24 milestones within the first 6 months. We were up and running. And again, they were all published as network milestones, but implemented and evaluated at the node level. But the word node didn't exist. The real pressure came, though, because if one node failed, the entire research network risked being eliminated from the network. And I think you can see there were challenges at many sites, not just in our network, but at others as well early on in meeting some of these milestones. Some examples of milestones were to deploy approaches to streamline research operations and processes. Well, it hit a lot of governance considerations around IRBs and DUAs and linkages to external data. As an example, what's a patient? We still have different counts, explainable differences in counts between patients in our PCORNet data mart and other counts of patients. Interestingly, the common data model for PCORI doesn't define a patient. It talks about having a patient identifier, but doesn't say what is a patient. Is somebody who has a reference lab sent and receives a medical record number patient? Those are issues that continuously come up. I think another issue was the just-in-time researcher preparation. When it came to streamlining research operations, all of the people tapped as PIs or site PIs for studies took that role seriously and wanted to understand what's going on behind the curtains when it comes to the data and assume responsibility and accountability locally for that. So it took a lot of time to explain different we ended up providing templated IRB language that could be used across studies. We had templated agreements between compliance and information assurance. We had guidance readily available when things didn't align between perhaps the data use agreements at the PCORI level and the local level. We could write books about those things. Another one was to have this distributed research network architecture PopMed instantiated as the tool. And that was pretty straightforward for the technical teams to do, but compliance and information assurance posed a question, well, you can do it, but should you do it? And that, again, reached into the whole governance level across and aligning the understanding of what that means from security and safety and privacy and all of those concerns. And again, was this going to be a kind of an experimental research project for a few years, or is it are we building a long-term and reusable resource? It's turned out to be a long-term and reusable resource, but it is, that was not certain at many points during the startup. And then I think the most significant issue is mapping data to the PCORNet common data model. Create a lot of mediation and a lot of negotiation. Calling in subject matter experts, as we traditionally think about them in information systems, insufficient. We also needed domain experts who understand the knowledge representations that were possible and weighed in on that as well. So these are just some examples of things that had to be resolved within 6 months, and some weren't. So what specific work was required? This is our mind mapping activity, and you can see fewer than 40% of the activities were technical. And I think we're happy to share this if anybody wants it, but I think this upper left-hand corner of the evaluation of node functions is really what I just want to say a couple things about, and that doesn't come out. I think it's an implicit expectation of the networks and network participation, but it's really not articulated or checked or moderated in any way. And it's really up to the individual organizations hosting a node. And this sort of work takes some real effort. and it requires probably new resources in a lot of organizations. There's a lot of discussion out there generally in the scientific fields about the absence of or the limited use of provenance metadata, for example, when it comes to data quality. What is a patient? Where did we get the identification of the patient? What is a medication mapping is extremely challenging. It's doable, but it's challenging. Where do we record the metadata about how we accomplish those mappings? Should we be taking, we had a great example of lab data, which needs to be linked to link codes or encoded with lab link codes. And our pathology informatics group was just going through a major rework and revision of their coding applications. Which flavor of a sodium order do you want to a result? Which, those things were very difficult to negotiate. And I think this whole area of evaluation of node functions, I think it's ripe for research. And there are calls out there that are looking for that type of work to be done. Our third question then is what theoretically grounded questions should be considered. And then just a reminder, infrastructure is these activities that contribute to the establishment locally. And the considerations that we adopted and directly come out of this literature on infrastructuring from the CSCW community are enacting technology, organizing the work, and institutionalizing efforts. And the considerations and the conflicts in these cells arise around aligning the end goals of the project with existing work, organizational efforts, and long-term institutionalizing of the goals and alignment with institutional goals. Motivating and ensuring participation. We drew on resources from many, many different departments. It wasn't just an IT effort or just the research community. And then designing for use. So how far do you go on making things really robust versus good enough for the initial startup period? And that's quite a challenging issue. A few examples under enacting technology. The goal is develop stable and usable infrastructure, but how does the effort that went into building a node correspond with other organizational priorities? That's what Mandel and Cohen were writing about. There are a lot of competing IT and research initiatives. And because of the timelines and the scope for rapid turnarounds, there are obvious conflicts in prioritization. How do you motivate ongoing participation of people who don't necessarily have this effort on their radar screen within their operational units or their research budgets? And how do you identify the work products that you can reassemble as needed? So an example of that might be the common data models. How internally are nodes going to reconcile PCORNet, OMOP, ACT, TriNetX, if you're one of their customers. There are some emerging tools coming out of some of the national initiatives right now, but that's a considerable amount of work. It creates tensions. Organizing the work. Again, how are you going to access and find the processes and expertise within your organization? Around how do you ensure that participants are going to communicate and facilitate communication, not be knowledge hoarders, but knowledge sharers rapidly within their internal groups and the external communities. So we've frequently pulled in domain experts and SMEs to, we had a conflict resolution either at the sub-network level or the top level. And interesting, because I'm thinking of it right now, this is complicated also by the idea of proprietary models that exist in our EHR systems and different information systems, and even in the data repositories within our organizations that we think of as being fairly neutral, have a lot of proprietary boundaries. And a lot of those commercially vended products come with pretty strict expectations about boundaries and what you can share and discuss with non-customers. And then designing, I think, again, this data quality, if we adopt a definition of data quality, it's fit to purpose. Well, the purpose varies by studies. Do we do quality data audits when we have different purposes for the studies, where a registry, which also has very highly curated clinical data, may exhibit conflicts with the EHR data in our data mart, which is kind of like take it and organize it and store it there. I think this issue of verification and validation of the data queries and the results returned, it really we have to put a lot more attention into this. Is it fit for the purpose, and is uncurated EHR data really our first choice to go to, or should be going to some of the registries? And then for institutionalizing, and this is how do you make the organization and how do you encourage the organization to sustain this effort over time? The pandemic response has obviously created competing needs, although also competing benefits. For example, you looked at the national COVID cohort that NCAT sponsors, some marvelous work coming out of that has motivated the alignment of governance and technology and all of some of the issues and tensions that have existed, and demonstrates some real potential value of these networks. But how are you going to sustain the dedicated resources for the node? They haven't been in budgets, and they haven't been in strategic plans typically. How do you articulate the benefits for the organization beyond participating in a single network? So if you're joining another network, how do you reuse some of the work that you've already done in PCORNet, for example? And this one's particularly interesting. How do you find the people and leverage opportunities that come out of node participation? There's a tremendous amount of knowledge and insights gained from this vast array of people who have been objects and active in engaging in the development of the node. I know at Michigan, we don't really have a knowledge management system that captures that. Maybe you do, but I think that's, we have to think about these work processes and how they can be scaled up into these new research paradigms. So the theory, again, I think we're really feeling pleased about the direction it gave us in classifying the objects and the infrastructural activities. There's growing evidence of the potential of network-based research, but this infrastructure and infrastructural nodes remains invisible, and we're not going to be successful moving forward without paying some attention to that very, I don't want to say low level, but that enabling node. I think the framework that we put out there starts to make visible, or can start to make visible, the objects and activities, but you have to ask questions. And obviously, I think there's some further studies needed to kind of expand this, validate the questions, and at other nodes and in the context of other networks. Feel free to email us. Lisa Ferguson is still actively involved as a superb project manager across some of these efforts, and Irong Luo was embedded in the operational research IT group as a social scientist out of our School of Information, and really has experience dealing with federated research in some of these large physical science projects, and was extremely helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcy. We've now accumulated quite a few questions in the question Q&A box. And I think a good way to proceed here would, since we can now open up the dialogue so people can ask their questions directly of the participants, is to just go to the questions from the beginning and let people address their questions directly online. So if you have a question, you want to ask it, please unmute. So we have a question here from Rumi Nusrat. I don't know if I pronounced your name correctly, Rumi. But their question is, do you want to ask it directly or do you want me to ask it for you? Rumi asks, what are the reasonable approaches to identify assumptions for a study design in order to estimate sample size to assess an intervention effect? It makes it clear that this is probably a complicated question, requires a complicated answer. But of course, when you're submitting a question to one of these distributed networks, how do you have an understanding of what's likely to be the sample size upon which the answer is based? And I'd be happy to get an answer from Jeff or Marcy.
Well, my experience on the end of executing on those research studies, they're typically preceded by a cohort query. So before the research query comes in, a cohort identification query comes in. On the back end of the study design, there are statisticians involved who clearly understand and advise on not having too large of a sample, not having too small of a sample. But I think what's really important is these studies are really designed, the motivation was comparative effectiveness studies and get as much data as you can out there on as many people as you can. The cohort queries, for the adaptable studies as an example, can help identify potential participants for more typically modeled clinical trials with powered sample sizes. Jeff?
Yeah, thanks for that, Marcy. And it's a great question. There are a couple answers, but the top line version is these networks should be able to do simple things quickly. So if you need to know, just know, does this network have enough people that would meet my general needs? The idea is that answer should happen. You would want that answer to happen in seconds, but it shouldn't take a really long time. It shouldn't be particularly expensive to know how many people took this drug or how many people have this condition. And that's exactly for both scenarios, right? And then I want to run an analytic like comparative effectiveness study in the network, or I want to find the top 10 sites with patients who look like the ones that are in my trial to then go and do a study. That second is actually our whole use case. That's the whole business model of TriNetX is that second. I wonder where the people are that meet this clinical trial criteria. But the bottom line is these networks, it's not worth all of that effort if it takes an awful lot of effort to answer these. It's not worth the effort of creating these networks if it's really hard to answer simple questions. So that's the really important part of doing this work.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Frank Mannion, I see you online here. I'll let you ask your question directly.
Yeah, hi. I think this question might be to both people, but I think Jeff had brought up the concept of minimal necessary during his presentation. And I think Marcy may have actually addressed this in the definitional part of the framework that she presented. But I'm going to ask it anyway, because it is, so how is minimal necessary defined, and has that become an issue across the different compliance groups in different PCORI and other shared network nodes, and how do you reach consensus on that?
So it's a great question. So in the public health surveillance space, so for Sentinel, when you knew you knew the kinds of things you're asking, and you also knew what the results would look like, and they were aggregate, the minimum necessary didn't, we weren't doing that on a case-by-case basis. We actually had, well, Sentinel was public health surveillance, and there was actually no IRB, but there was all of the other, so it wasn't about research, it was just about privacy and HIPAA. But we got basically agreement that the structure of the queries and the results that they generate were acceptable, and it wasn't assessed on a case-by-case basis. and there was a lot of work at the coordinating center and trust placed in the coordinating center to do it. The backup was every query, all the sites always had the authority to review the results, right? So, and it was, I called it asynchronous by design because all the informatics people were making fun of me. But it was, we actually had a human in the interaction on purpose so that all the nodes, all the sites were, we actually had the chance to review the results before they released it. That was how CoreNet would work, and Sentinel and the others.
Any comments, Marcy?
Well, just in the node level, Frank, I think we got involved. This would fit under our evaluation activities, and we, especially in the early stages, pulled in very senior faculty to look at the results that were coming out of those queries and to say, how does this seem right to you? You know, that you have this number of heart failure patients of this type, for example, and yeah, I think it fits under that evaluation of the node work.
And we have another question here from, once again, I apologize for mispronouncing this, Apurva Bell. You want to ask your question directly?
Hi, thank you. I think I asked my question a bit too early before the TriNetX was introduced. But I would like to know if there's a process to get involved in this, because I manage a global network and we're trying to get de-identified data across the globe, including LMICs, and they do not have good EHR systems, or they have created in-house electronic health records. And how do we create a process for them to extract the data and, you know, create the analysis that we require? Thank you.
Yeah, so you could say, so I now sit in a global federated network. I'm happy to talk you through. We've got, I think we're at 17 countries now. They're hard, they're really hard, right? It was an awful lot of money to build it, and it had to have a very specific purpose. I see a lot of country networks within country networks, but those are often, you know, directed. There has to be a really good reason to build them. The Italians are trying to build a safety surveillance network like the FDA has, and actually Europe just created a network for the European Medicines Agency, but again, it was for the European Medicines Agency. It wasn't for anyone, it's not for anyone else. So you do have to think through the, I hope that the governance makes it a little easier for others to use. FDA's governance was actually great, but I don't have a great answer for you, but you can certainly reach out, because maybe there might be some consistent partners actually from you and what I've been trying to do.
Thank you.
Okay, and then we have a question from VG Vinod Vidzvarin. VG, you want to ask your question directly? Let me then ask for you. Common data models are a good way to normalize data that allows similar queries to run on multiple sites. However, different sites may have different ways to extract transformed data. What are the best practices and standards to ensure that different sites to run identical processes in the pipelines?
That's a tough one. Jeff, I'll give you it's a tough one to do. Maybe the answer is pretty theoretical, but from an operational perspective, I think looking at data set catalogs, I think we need metadata about how we're doing that harmonization, because there's a lot of information loss as you move across levels of granularity on concepts, for example. And we don't currently have that. We need an emphasis on data curation at the local level for real world data. There's a lot of data curation done on registries, for example, that take EHR data. There's a lot of curation done on our laboratory processing systems. We don't do that on electronic health record data in the raw. And I don't know if we should either, but I think before we don't want to impose that kind of a burden on a system that's primarily there to take care of patients, not to answer research questions. So I think the best practices really have to come around a collective community effort in which nodes participate to start to capture a metadata about the harmonization efforts and how they proceeded. I don't know, Jeff?
Yeah, no, it's, I don't know if I should call it an Achilles heel or not. Funded networks typically have some requirement or responsibility to try to do some of this data curation. When it's kind of a more kind of Wild West network, there isn't that requirement, but it's actually just really hard to do. I think it's going to become down to more about documenting what you've done, doing your data curation, and being transparent about it. So there's a piece of just transparency in what your data look like across a set of metrics. But of course, we don't have a standard set of metrics either, right? So working on those metrics, people are working on it. So people are working on standard set of metrics. This is what I'd always want to see. And this is, it was a, FDA Sentinel spent an awful lot of money doing this, but CoreNet also did, and they actually did it for different purposes. And they had different levels of, they had a different bar to be approved between Sentinel and CoreNet because of the different needs of the network. It's really complicated.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jeff. I think there's going to be a lot of lessons learned on this coming out of the National COVID Cohort Collaborative, where there's really some tooling developing to do some mapping even across the common data models of ACT and PCoreNet and TriNetX and OMOP, for example. And that's going to shine a spotlight on the variations on the harmonization that was done to those specific model or models at the local level. So I think we need some of that work to be a little more transparent.
Yeah, and Marcy, just because you mentioned it, and it's one of the things I think about all the time, and from the very beginning, is thinking about mapping and what it means. And I guess I would always argue you leave the data as granular as you can. You can map it if you need to make it easier for someone to query and poke around, and there's a lot of great use cases for it. But we really should try to not pretend that an ICD-10 code is a SNOMED code, because it's not. And we do a lot of mapping, and it's TriNetX does an awful lot of terminology mapping all across the world because of our use case, but that might be a different use case in drug safety, where you might not want to do the mapping in the same way. So it's be careful. You just don't want to lose what you really captured, what was really captured in the system, even if you're trying to make it easier for the end user.
Okay, we're about out of time, but I want to let Sarah Green in here as a last question. Sarah, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Terrific presentations. And I put this question in for Jeff before Dr. Harris, but I was just really thinking about, as a veteran of several networks as well, the difference between a network comprised of homogeneous partners, say they're all health systems, versus a network with health systems and insurers and pharma and the rest. And just your quick thoughts. I know we just have maybe 10 seconds about whether it's more, whether the mixture of types of partners makes a difference in terms of garnering cooperation, articulating the value, et cetera. So thanks.
Yeah. Hey, Sarah, it's good to see you. Yeah, I'll say it's great to have diversity. You will have different governance needs, and they have different sensitivities. A health insurer is not the same as a health system, and different than a registry, and you can kind of go down the line. Often you don't ask the same question. You wouldn't ask an identical question of those different sources. You might ask different similar questions of those sources. So I just need to know who's who. But it does complicate, it likely complicates your governance. But I think, I don't know if to say more the merrier, or more diverse the merrier, but you just need to understand who has what and recognize that the governance is it just comes.
And I think that, Jeff, the terms have to be defined, and patient is a great, what is a patient to a healthcare insurer versus a patient to a healthcare system that runs multiple services that don't always involve billable services.
So I just want to wrap up here and highlight one theme that I think has run through this whole session. And that is that these networks are not primarily networks which depend on great technology, although that's needed, but they are highly socio-technical. The issues that have been raised and discussed have more to do with how we negotiate and organize these efforts and have less to do with how we actually make it work at a technical level. And I think this is a lesson that we're learning throughout this whole set of discussions about how we build a learning health systems. I want to thank so much our presenters today, and also thank you for the great questions that we've had today. And you will see that there's a link available to you to fill out a post-event survey. There will be a link to the materials once we get them put together that you can see here. And we're looking forward to seeing many of you in our next seminar series event on March 22nd, where we talk further about some of these networks and the specifics that are involved. So thank you very much, everybody. And it's great to see you today and to be part of this collaboratory session. Goodbye now.